Hello, I'm Dan Gibson.
And I'm Chad Dole.
And in this video we want to look at the book, Let the Stone Speak, but we're going to go through the table of contents, and we're going to have a look at what is in each of the chapters. That gives you an idea of what this book is all about. So the very first chapter is an introductory chapter, and in that chapter we have a chart that sort of lays the foundation for the whole book. And show it on the screen so you can have a look at it. You'll see across the middle of this chart a black line, and it starts on one side with a timeline, and it moves off towards the right. And you'll see there we have both Christian dates and Islamic dates. The Islamic date starts at the year 0, that's the Hijrah, where the Muslim moved down to Medina. That's where they built the first mosque. That's where the religion really formulated and took off. And so we started that date because we are looking at mosques. So we start with the first mosque that was built by the followers of Muhammad. And as we go along, you'll see that in the chart, above there's information and below there's information. What is above is labeled manuscripts, and what is below is labeled places of prayer. So if we look at manuscript history at the top, we see there is 200 years of silence. And then we have the writers, the Islamic writers writing. And so when people say, oh yeah, an early writer said this, generally they're talking about the early writers start about 200 and some years in and go over to the end of the 300 into the 400 years later of Islamic history. And we see that there is archaeological activity going on during those 200 silent years. So we no longer have to just rely on manuscripts that look back. We can actually look at the foundations or at actual structures that were built at the time during those 200 years. And we can extrapolate a story of what is going on by when mosques were built, where they were built, and the direction of the Qibla that they had in these mosques. And so we can use archaeological evidence to fill in those missing years.
Of course, when you look at the bottom half of that chart, one of the surprising things that you'll see is that the Petra Qibla was in existence from the outset of Islam up until about 132, which is a good stretch of time, and you found a few mosques afterward which also had that Qibla.
Yeah, some of them are very interesting. If you want to really get into this and look at the mosque, you need to use the database. And go online, go to the Qibla tool, and then look at the more further information, and you can there's a web page for each of the mosques that are listed in that. And you can go through and look and discover, and some of those later mosques have really fascinating stories about why they chose Petra hundreds of years later.
And if you look at that chart again at year 87, 88, that's when we see two other Qiblas emerge. The Between Qibla, and we're entering that time of confusion, as well as the Mecca Qibla. So we're almost a full century after the outset of Islam, and we're still a full century before we have any reliable historical manuscripts on this time. So the fact that the manuscripts don't necessarily echo the archaeological history isn't surprising. There's been such a lapse of time. But these Qiblas, this archaeological record, provides us with the historical record we need to begin to fill in those decades, fill in those centuries, and determine what happened with early Islam. And this appears in the first chapter of the book because this chart is what the book seeks to flesh out.
So when we move on to the second chapter, talking about the discovery, it wasn't all at one time. This wasn't just a eureka moment. Oh my, we discovered this. Rather, it's something that in the process of examining early mosques, this became more and more evident, and over time and over the years, this whole theory has been fleshed out, and we can begin to see it in more detail. Now we have lots of mosques. So chapter 2 looks at the unknown mosques. These are ones that most of them were rebuilt multiple times, so we can no longer tell what was intended back then because we have no foundation. We just have modern new structures on the same location. So we do list the unknown mosques, and you can go through those and look at those that we were unable to classify. Otherwise, they're classified according to the Qibla that are there. Yeah.
Another important reason a mosque may be unknown is Dan has set the parameters for a mosque being accurate. It needs to be within 10 degrees of the target location, be it Petra, Mecca, or between. And even a mosque that may have been intentionally directed toward Mecca or Petra, if it's outside those 10 degrees, you will classify it as unknown.
That's right, especially those that are called open-air mosques. Many of these are just out in a field, and the people have moved the rocks aside, made a pile of rocks around, and they were inside this and they worshipped, and maybe at the beginning or later they put a little mihrab. You can tell it's a place of prayer, but it's very hard to determine because it's not accurately built. It doesn't have a really straight wall. It's just a place where people prayed, and those are hard. So they end up often being unknown because we just can't determine it. So after looking at the various Qiblas, we move on to chapter 3, and here we have two statisticians come along, and they have written some papers. Actually unknown to me, they wrote at least the first paper, and then they worked on a second paper. And these are peer-reviewed academic papers that are done by scholars who have written many papers, peer-reviewed papers, and have published over 100 papers in journals. These are notable scholars in this area, and in the whole area of statistics, and so they have now tackled this whole idea of the Qibla. They said, well, if Dan Gibson has got data and we can look at it, we can do things mathematically with that to assess, what does this data actually tell us?
So what Dr. Schum and Goldstein were able to do is put Dan's data through a number of different mathematical formulas and test them for their accuracy. And it would be great if you have a mathematical background especially to look through the chapter, but they concluded, and that's why it's early on in the book, that in terms of those dawning decades, centuries of Islam, that Dan's data is accurate and the Petra Qibla is accurate, which indicates that it seems it indeed was possible for these mosque builders to direct their mosques over long distances.
Now, I'm not a mathematician, I'm not a statistician, so I remember being worried because there are these unknown mosques. There are things that just sort of outliers. And I remember them saying to me, don't be surprised, that's the way data is, and we were expecting those. If you had massaged the data and made it fit, then we could have easily determined that right away and said, no, this is not accurate data. So I tried to be true to the data that we found and put it on the internet, and they came along and tested it. So that's interesting, and if you're a mathematician, you'll enjoy that chapter.
So for chapter 3, now we have this question. If it seems it was possible for early mosque builders to direct their mosques in a specific direction over long distances, we have to theorize how they were able to do that because they did not have advanced mathematics. And what have you found there, Dan?
Well, that's something that I just couldn't get my head around. I knew we need to be able to duplicate what they had done. So that we could just say it can be done, because there were people arguing and saying they couldn't do it. They couldn't look over the horizon and decide where something was across the horizon. Now, the different people have tackled this, and a lot of people tackled it from the background of mathematics. And when I came along, I got reading some of the earlier books, different books that were there, and I really was fascinated with the navigational aspect, because navigators need to travel, and they would travel on the ocean. They need to know where over the ocean are they aiming. So navigation has gone through stages of time, but navigation on land is different than navigation on the sea. And so I started digging this out, and over the years, this was always a thing that was pestering me. And it wasn't until digging into some of the papers written by Dr. King that he described an earlier method, and he dug this out of some of the early writers, the Islamic writers, who were talking about how they had done it earlier. And so the thought was, can we duplicate what was done earlier? And this has become known as the Indian Circle because it got associated with India later, and the whole Indian Ocean and how things were done on the Indian Ocean. And so, but earlier they were able to measure, and we go through that whole Indian Circle thing, how they would have built a mosque, how they would have they could accurately get north, south, east, and west to within a fraction of a degree. That's, they can get that really accurate, and then how they could go on beyond that and build directions and be able to tell where something was over the horizon.
And the amazing thing about that is extrapolating from that, we can look at your data then, see a distant mosque facing Petra at 2 degrees, and really marvel at the fact that they were able to accomplish this.
Yeah. One of the arguments made by Dr. King a little bit later was not only how do you do it, but there are errors in that early system. The farther you get away, the more error that's introduced. So when you're very close and doing something, they could be quite accurate. When they were looking at 500 miles, even 1,000 miles, it was starting to get a little more inaccurate. And by the time you're building mosques, say if Petra is the center you're trying to face, and by the time you're out in Morocco, you would get a greater degree of error. And so we look at that and examine that, put that together, and then compare it to some of the mosques that were built to enable us to be able to see what kind of errors were in those mosques and see that reflected in the mosques that are out there. So it's a fascinating chapter. Again, a little bit technical, but I think you'll enjoy it. So then the question comes along, well, what about Mecca? And when did Mecca start? If everything was towards Petra, was there a Mecca there before? And we look very briefly at the early archaeological history of the city of Mecca, and that really not much is there. And there have been some people who are not archaeologists who have suggested, oh, this is the house of Khadija, or this is, because people have gone around and tried to find where these places are. The problem is when you match them up with descriptions of the first places, you have problems. And so really there is no recorded scholarly record of any early things going on in Mecca. And so another argument then is, well, what about maps? And then that's another challenge that we faced.
Yeah, one of the most influential documents in terms of this whole argument about an early Mecca are Ptolemy's early maps, because there was a location called Makaroba, which, because it starts with an M, must be Mecca, and if you plot it, seems roughly maybe in the right place, and we go to great lengths in order to describe how that really isn't accurate.
Right, and this town is actually on a riverbank. And so it's got a river flowing by it. And so this was one of the keys that got me going. There's a river by Mecca. Well, there's not now. So what about rivers? And we can track ancient rivers because there are riverbeds. And even though rivers might move a little bit, you're still going to be able to track it. So using 4 rivers that Ptolemy said were in Arabia, went back and looked at 4 rivers that sailors would have noticed as they sailed by. There's a river, and so they, even though it's dry now, when it rains, water does run down these rivers, and sailors could tell because there's fresh water flowing out of the mountains, they could go and get water to drink. So rivers were very important, and they're marked on Ptolemy's map. So used the 4 rivers and looked at Ptolemy's map and looked at a modern map, compared it, realized Ptolemy made a few errors in his map because he didn't recognize how large some of the deserts were. So he had the desert smaller, and therefore his maps are a bit skewed, which is typical of Ptolemy. He does the same thing over in Ceylon, in Sri Lanka, and so forth. So we understand that map maker sitting way over in Alexandria and mapping places he'd never seen. Interesting thing with Ptolemy is he wasn't making a flat map. He was working on a globe, a round globe of the earth, and that's how he plotted it. And he put lines on his globe, made his own lines of latitude and longitude, and all we have now is not the map. We have the list of latitude and longitude, and where rivers are, where mountains are, and where cities are. And so that's what we worked from. And it came out that when you look at it, we can now identify the places that Ptolemy was listing. And you know what? Marcoba is not on the place where Mecca is. So that was pretty clear to us as we went through it.
To close out the 5th chapter about Mecca as a place of antiquity, we drew from the work of Ian Morris, who's done a lot of work looking at the documentary history of even how scholarship has come to believe that this Macaroba must be Mecca. And his conclusion is that there is no evidence for Mecca's antiquity. And we found his work very helpful as well in order to summarize this great scope of scholarly work that's been done in the area.
Right. Well, then we moved on because in our chart that we have at the beginning, we are talking about places of prayer. We don't say mosques, we say places of prayer. That's because not only did people pray and face the Qibla direction in mosques, they also prayed in their homes or in palaces or in other buildings. And so whenever they built a large building, and very early on, the early Arabs, as wealth poured in, as they were conquering, began to build bigger and bigger houses. And some very large, huge palaces, built almost like castles, and they're called qasrs, where we get our word castle from. And they would all face a courtyard. There'd be rooms around the outside and an inner courtyard, and then the gates into the inner courtyard. So visitors would come into the inner courtyard, and there would be all kinds of rooms around, often multiple families living around that courtyard, all from the same tribe, uncles, cousins, brothers, all these people living together. They had this big building, and in there would be a designated place of prayer. So we looked at that, and what we discovered is that they not only had a place of prayer that they had oriented in their Qibla direction, the whole structure was oriented in a Qibla direction. And if you look at it, we could just go down and look at the structure shape, and then we could use archaeological reports to look at the rooms inside, and it became very obvious that there were rooms that were similar to some of the very early mosques, and they were the places of prayer inside of other structures. So we use the qasr, and we have a whole chapter on how we came to those conclusions, what the qasrs are, how they face, and it's interesting, some towns had several qasrs, and each of those qasrs have a different direction that they faced in them. And we can see that over time. Originally they faced Petra, then later the between Qibla would come along, and then later they would face Mecca, often with a building built outside, because the qasrs are already oriented, but if you want to face Mecca now, you have to go to a separate building, and this is where you really see the development of separate mosques as buildings, being developed all over.
Yeah, there are instances in the floor plans of some of these qasrs where you can see that the original Qibla wall was directed in one direction, Petra or between, and there was a wedge put in the wall, and a very awkward mihrab was installed in order to face it, as much as they could toward Mecca. And these adjustments were always being made. Or they would build another mosque outside of the qasr, which had a Petra Qibla, that faced toward Mecca.
One of the other options was to put a mark on the wall, maybe in the corner, and there are some mosques that actually have a second Qibla marked off in the corner in the direction you want to pray. So you actually have two Qiblas in the mosque. Even Al-Aqsa, if you go to Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, up there on the mountain, at the top there, you go in, and if you get a chance to go in, notice how all the rugs and everything are oriented so people will pray not to the Qibla wall. It's all shifted over because the Qibla wall faces Petra, but they face Mecca when they pray, and so there's a shift inside, and they're not praying towards the Qibla wall, they're praying off-center in the mosque. Okay, let's move on to a case for Petra. And here we looked at some different arguments. Why don't you take us off on the first argument?
Yeah, the first argument we made was about the name Petra and Mecca. There's a whole arrangement of arguments to be made that Petra wasn't important to Islam, doesn't appear in the Quran, anything like that, and that there's no connection with Mecca. But drawing from some of the work Dan has done with Peter Hermos and Joseph Hannon, have been able to draw together a linguistic, like a name argument, that actually Petra and Mecca shared a number of titles over their history. And even within the documents and in the Quran itself, there's some evidence that actually the two were interchangeable in terms of name.
So you could imagine that a town would have a name, and then some people would go off to another place, and when they got there, so people from York in England went over to America, and when they started to build a new town there, they called it New York. And so we have York and New York. But we also have other towns that have exactly the same name when people went to another place. And some just chose a name. So we have a town over in eastern Canada that continually get people arriving there, getting out, and looking very confused, because it has the same name as a city in Australia. And so people think they've got a good cheap ticket to Australia, but they actually arrive in Canada and realize that it comes to them, there are two cities by the same name. And so I believe in this case we had the original city, and Petra was just one of the names given by the Romans, and it's not necessarily the name that everybody called it at the time. That's the name we know it of today, and that came from the 1800s when they resurrected this name. But that's not the name that's written down there. It's Rechem, and that's a name that was very common, but there are others. And Rechem is mentioned in the Quran, and we look at that. But there are other names. And so one of the titles of Petra was, it is the mother of colonies. And if we go to the Quran, we see Qura, the mother of villages. And so very similar names. And we just have a chart at the end. We look at the names of Petra and the names of Mecca, the titles, the things that were used to describe, and they are very close. So I believe, looking at this, looking at the archaeological evidence, that when they moved the black rock from Petra down to Mecca in Saudi Arabia, the name Mecca followed it down. And so then, for a while, they have two Meccas. The challenge is to know, well, when you're reading Islamic history, which location are they referring to, the first Mecca or the second Mecca? And that is something you can only know by looking at the timeline to see where it was and which one of these, looking at the archaeology, seeing where the shift went, and realizing there was two Meccas. Now, which one are they talking about?
Exactly. So in the second part of this chapter on Petra, making a linguistic case for Petra, we draw a lot from the work of Mark Dury, who is sort of springboarded off of the linguistic work of a scholar named Al-Jalad, who has been analyzing the grammar of the inscriptions all over Arabia, and for our interest, particularly Northern Arabia. And what Drury has been able to do is come to the conclusion that the grammar of the Aramaic and the Arabic behind it, spoken in Northern Arabia by the Nabateans, is a good correlation for the grammar of the Quran. And the reason this matters is because for generations, scholars have been searching for the Arabic which gave birth to the Quran. And they've searched in southern Arabia, they've searched with the Bedouin, and they've never been able to come to a satisfactory connection. And Drury believes he has found that connection in northern Arabia.
And with the Nabateans, and the capital city of the Nabateans was Petra. And now when we have the Petra scrolls and they examine them and look at them, they are finding grammatical construction similar to the Quran that is not used in any other part of Arabia. So that just narrows it down and saying the language that was used in Petra is very similar to the language that was used in the Quran at almost the same time. The Petra scrolls were written during the lifetime of Muhammad. So that gives us something that is written at the exact same time period. And so that really helps us nail down that if you're looking for the source of the Arabic language used in the Quran, you must look at Petra, because that's where you'll find the similarities.
Now, in the last part of this chapter, one of the intricacies of this whole problem is that the Nabateans wrote their Arabic in Aramaic, which is actually what gave birth to the cursive script of Arabic from Aramaic. And so scholars haven't always naturally looked to Nabatean Aramaic script with Arabic behind it in order to do a grammatical search for some of the essences of early Quranic Arabic. But what a lot of scholars have found is that there are certain passages of the Quran that if you are to remove their vowel pointings so that they just have that Nabatean Aramaic script, because Arabic script was originally Aramaic, and read them as Aramaic, they actually make more sense, which is quite a staggering discovery.
Yeah, we looked at a number of books, had to order them and get them and pour through them, and we ended up looking a lot at what Luxemburg says in his book on the origins of the Quran and the origins of Arabic. And this whole thing about the link between Aramaic and Arabic is fascinating. And it appears that at some point the Aramaic morphed into the Arabic that we know today. And so the question was, when and how did it do that? And that's when we came across Ibn Abu Dawood. Now, Abu Dawood wrote some of the hadiths. He's one of the Sahih writers, who's the correct writers of hadith, and so Abu Dawood's known everywhere. His son, Ibn Abu Dawood, asked his father a question one time about this very thing, and his father said it was Hajjaj. And it comes back to Hajjaj again. We just keep coming up with this guy. His father said Hajjaj was the guy who did it. And today, traditionally, Muslims believe that Hajjaj added vowel markings to the Quran. That much has come down to us. The question is, how much did he change? And so Ibn Abu Dawood sits down and he writes out a number of cases where it was this before and Hajjaj changed it to this. So we pull that up and have a look at some of those and realize some of them are quite substantial changes. We use the work of Arthur Jeffrey as well, as he looked into this same question, and we look at a number of different sources where everybody says that Hajjaj really re-edited the Quran. So I think Hajjaj was important not only in rebranding Islam, but also he was important in that he actually messed with some of the meaning of the words as he put the vowel points on. He wanted an Arabic word here, not an Aramaic that was forgotten, and therefore some of it he just changed things a little bit, and some of them don't even actually make much sense, but there they are today.
Yeah, it's worth taking a look at this chapter for yourself, and make sure you catch the nuance there. If the text of the Quran was written without these vowel pointings, it could be read as Aramaic in places. And if Hajjaj simply added the vowel pointings, which may have been a convenience, he could have also changed the Aramaic to Arabic, and we make that case in the chapter.
Right. So, and a lot of people are writing on this. And there have been conferences going on and things. People are really starting to catch an interest in this whole area. Well, we move on to chapter 8 now, and the question comes up then, well, if Petra was the original Mecca, then where was the Kaaba? Where did they face? And so what we've done is we looked at the history of the Kaaba, and the histories have been written down, and it's been built and rebuilt several times, and during the lifetime of Muhammad, the Kaaba was rebuilt. And a writer, Azraqi, he records the story of the rebuilding of the Kaaba and how Muhammad came down and how he was the one who put the black stone in place. All this has been recorded for us, but Azraqi also includes something very interesting. He writes down the measurements of the sides of the Kaaba.
So if we're trying to make the case stand that Petra is the original holy city, there must have been a Kaaba there. You have these measurements. I mean, is it a pie-in-the-sky thing to say, hey, is there a structure that suits those measurements?
I thought of that originally, and it took me about 5 seconds to say where it was, because I had seen something, and I knew it was there, and it was something I had looked at over the years, because there is an altar there standing in front of Qasr al-Bint. But it's a little bit off-center. It's not in the center, and that just always seems strange to me. And Qasr al-Bint was built, I think, at a later date than this. I was just looking at it, and I always thought, why is that altar out in front, off-center, doesn't fit, something's not right. So when I read about this, I thought, I wonder if that's it. So I have Azraqi's measurements, and remember, it's a cube, but it's a cube that is not square. That's the thing. That's the key to finding this place, is he gives us 4 measurements because each side is a different length. And we went out and measured that altar, and guess what? It fits exactly. That is, including the steps that go up into it. Now, what we find fascinating, if you then compare it to the Kaaba in Mecca, if you remove the steps from the first one, that equals exactly the size of the Kaaba in Mecca. So something's going on here, and so we look at that Kaaba, do the measurements, and you can look at it, but you'll have to make up your own mind if you think this is the actual place. At this point, not a lot of excavations have been done, and not a lot of academic studies, scholarly studies, and papers have not been written on this. So this is something that we have noticed, we put together, but it seems to be very strong.
Yeah,
argument.
Even as a preliminary survey that you've done, the fact that it has those 4 irregular sides and it suits Azraqi's record is really compelling.
That's right. Well, we've gotten about halfway through the table of contents, and I think it's probably a long enough video. We're going to stop here, and we're going to do another video to finish off the book and what else is in the book. So this is Dan and Chad saying goodbye, and have a look at that table of contents 2 video coming up.
Take care.